Hello. I haven't done a facecam video in like 5 years. So ever since I discovered virtual modular synthesis, which basically changed my life and allowed me to realize my dream of making my own electronic music, I've kind of just been banging music out, right? However, I have been working on a new album for the past 4 or 5 months or so, and I figured this time it deserved a little more than just an unceremonious Bandcamp upload that I don't really tell anyone about. So basically, the new album, I sort of made it in celebration of finishing the black pit of hell that is high school, and it was very important to me that I finished it this summer before I go off to college, and I did. So I figured to promote this album, I would dive into and break down one of the most intricate tracks I've ever made that's on the album.
Kark Unwriggle Mix.
What does the title mean? I don't know. It's aesthetically pleasing. It's electronic music. Who cares? I'm going to be going through both the virtual modular synthesizer patch and the Ableton project, and I'm going to break down my creative choices, how I arranged it, what influenced everything, and of course the production itself. The album is called Solong, suckRs, releases September 25th. Ideally, I'll get it up on pretty much every streaming platform. I don't have the best luck with digital distributors, but it will at the very least be up on Bandcamp and YouTube. And, maybe, just maybe, if I can get it figured out, it will get a physical release too of some sort. So, to the probably 12 people who are going to watch this video, thank you for stopping by. I'm very excited to talk about this stuff. I'm very passionate about it. Anyways, let's get into it. Hello. I am definitely recording this on the same day. So this beautiful program you're currently looking at is called VCV RACK. It's basically virtual modular synthesis, and it's what I use to produce most of my music. Before I really discovered VCV RACK, I knew what modular synthesis was, and I really wanted to get into it, but I was also under the impression that I had to drop 25 grand on a rig the size of a server rack. But by chance one day I discovered this program, and it is honestly one of the most bang for your buck programs you can invest in as a musician. It's free by default, but even if you want the premium version with all the modules you can get, it's like $150 as opposed to, $20,000. So as you can see, it's a little bit of a mess right now, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through each of these 6 channels on my mixer module here, and I'll just be dissecting them individually. So pretty much all this stuff highlighted here composes the glitchy chords that effectively open the track. So basically, it's a sine wave and a square wave coming out of this one oscillator, going into this filter. This delay goes into this compressor here. We'll talk about that a bit more later. This first envelope here is basically the primary one that I used for this sound, giving it the shape it has, because otherwise it would just be a drone. I have this random module here modulating each parameter of the envelope generator, so it has a little bit more dynamic variability. The edges are constantly being cut off and smoothed, and it becomes a very glitchy, unique sort of sound. The gate going into the envelope is being controlled by this master clock over here, which, as you can see, there's a bunch of cables coming out of it. It's basically controlling the time of pretty much everything in the patch. So this master clock is going into this clock divider / multiplier here, and that is going into the sequencer. And if you see here, these two divide and multiply parameters are being modulated by these control voltage sources. And what that does is it gives the rhythm like randomness, like it'll stop, it'll start, it'll slow down, it'll speed up, and it's kind of random depending on what source you use to control it. It's a little more predictable if you use an LFO, whereas if you use one of these random modules, it's not quite as much. The second envelope here is kind of another element of dynamic variability that I added into this sound. This ADSR envelope generator is taking voltage from the second clock multiplier / divider here, and it's a lot more slowed down. Because what this does is it basically randomly will pretty much yank up the frequency on the sound, giving it like some spice, So I have all 3 channels of knobs from this sequencer here going into the merge module, which gives it polyphony, so 3 or more notes, or 2 or more notes playing at once. That goes into my quantizer. I don't remember what mode I have it set to. And then that goes all the way back into the central oscillator, and you have a chord sound. Yeah, so yet another time jump in the recording process because, you know, life. So the next sound I have here is the bass. What's really fun about the creative process for me with the tools I have is a lot of the time I can just go in with a vague idea of what I want. Like, oh, I want these chords, I want a bit like a techno-ish sounding bass, I want these drums to sound like this. And then I can go into the software and sort of just let the modules themselves inspire me. A lot of the time I'll end up down a completely different direction from what I originally intended, and a lot of the time I just go with it. But I think this particular sound is sort of the closest to what I originally intended for this track, which is sort of like a techno-ish thing. It's not exactly what it ended up being, but I'm glad I was able to incorporate an element of that sort into the final result. So in order to make it a much lower sound, I turned the frequency knob on my sound source much further down. I ran the oscillator into another filter here, but this time, instead of just plugging the low-pass filter into both the left and right outlets on the mixer like I normally do, I thought it'd be interesting to put both the low-pass and the high-pass filter. And so with some panning here on the mixer channel, it creates a very interesting sweeping effect, where it's just a slow game of tennis between each end of the frequency spectrum. I have a really short envelope here with only some slight modulation on the decay, sustain, and release. I have a fairly slow triangle wave modulating my clock multiplier, and then I primarily just use this slowed random module to modulate a bunch of different parameters across multiple modules. I am particularly proud of this sound because it is sort of more conventional than the rest of the sound palette on the track, and yet I think it fits in with everything else very well. Okay, time for the drums. In the past, I've normally just used like standard drum sequencers like this one, for example. And while these are fun and reliable and all, I wanted to do something different this time. So what you're seeing here is 3 sample drum sounds, a kick, snare, and hat, which I think I got from this like free hip-hop boom bap pack that I downloaded a while ago. I don't even remember exactly where I got it from. But I've always loved like trip-hop and instrumental hip-hop, so I've been using the pack pretty frequently in my music, and I'm really liking the results. So the 3 LFOs here are modulating the 3 clock dividers here, and that pretty much just creates sort of an offbeat rhythm. But anyway, I thought, what if, instead of running my drums through a basic drum sequencer, I clock them with the clock dividers and then modulate the clock dividers to create some like crazy offbeat cacophony stuff. And that is very much what I got. So each sample is going into the same overdrive pedal here. And then the kick specifically is going back into this compressor here. So the kick is sidechained with the chords actually. And so when the kick plays, the chords duck in volume. I actually didn't end up using this technique in the finished track, but I wanted to bring it up because I absolutely love sidechaining. It's one of my favorite mixing techniques. And trust me, I will be getting into it way more when I break down the Ableton project. But yeah, I love these drums. I'm really happy with how they turned out. They're pretty much the driving force of chaos behind the track, and I really think they just bring everything together. Okay, so the last part of this patch that I added are these secondary chords that close out the track. And it's crazy to me how even the smallest of tweaks can create an entirely different sound. Like, these chords are literally the exact same as the primary chords, but at a slower rate and with the quantizer pitched down 4 semitones. Initially, this noise source highlighted here was like an element baked into the sound, but once I got rid of it to see what it sounded like without the noise, I really liked it. So what's going on here is I made it so that the noise will periodically come in and out of the sound, so you can hear those raw synth sweeps while also having the noise come in to create more periodic chaos. The synth itself is a triangle and a saw wave running into this filter here, which I then ran into a Valhalla Supermassive reverb. I know in the drum section I mentioned using sidechain compression for the kick with the primary chords, but I also sidechained the secondary chords to the kick. And that choice was kind of pivotal when it came to this project, because the way it sounded before I had this sidechain compression was, it was kind of just a big misty drone that sort of muddied the mix a little bit, and it just wasn't sounding right. So the sidechain compression here really makes this sequence of the track more interesting, because it really just allows the kick drum to cut through the mix, and it just adds a lot more like rhythmic groove in general. Like I said, I love sidechain compression, maybe a little too much. So as I mentioned, this sound was initially a little boring until I made some slight changes to it, and like I said, it's really insane how a few slight changes make all the difference. Even turning the quantizer down 4 semitones was like the perfect sweet spot. So yeah, that's the whole VCV RACK patch. So one more thing I wanted to mention before we move on to the Ableton project, because this is very important. This module here was incredibly important to me in the technical process of getting the tracks recorded and arranged. Because initially, for a while, my issue was that I would only record my mixer channels here into a single stereo track. And while obviously there's nothing wrong with that, it just became kind of creatively frustrating after a while because I wasn't able to arrange my sounds at all. I kind of just had to like jam on the mixer over here, and if I didn't get a take right, I would just have to record it all over again. Whereas with this module, I can just record each channel of the mixer into an individual stereo file, and then I can port that into my DAW and arrange it however I want. Which was absolutely huge for me because my weakness doing this for a while was structuring my track. Creating the sounds themselves always came pretty naturally to me, but I struggled when it came to arranging the sounds in a way that, you know, sounded like a song. So this module absolutely came in clutch. If you work with VCV yourself and you want to use this technique, I'm going to show you exactly how I adjust the settings on this module. So it's important here that you set a destination file first. And then what I personally do is I check these 3 boxes here: save tracks and separated WAV files, save in stereo files, and group separated WAV files and directory. That way you get all the tracks conveniently placed in a nice little folder, and it's each individual sound that you've recorded into the mixer in stereo. Another thing you don't want to forget to do is to attenuate your inputs down to 6 dB, because if you have it at 0 dB, it's very easy to get a blown out sound, and then you have to do it all over again. I do want to add, I'm not entirely sure how this module works if you're not using this Mixmaster Mixer module, but in this case, just plugging the poly direct outs into the 16 and 32 inputs on this recorder seemed to work pretty well. The only other techniques of note that I used were these LFOs and random modules to adjust the panning randomly on the mixer, so the final mix just takes up more stereo space. And I also used a bunch of limiters for this project, which I don't normally do, but I do recommend it if you want to keep your sounds at a reasonable volume. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the Ableton section, and I'm going to show you how I arranged all of these sounds in my DAW. Okay, so this is the Ableton project where I arranged all those audio files that I recorded out of the VCV patch. It's nothing too crazy on a technical level, but this is the first Ableton project of this size that I've created. You know what, I'm going to move my webcam so it's not in the way of anything. So in total, this project consists of 10 tracks. The first 2 tracks are for the primary chords, then there's the bass, and then there's a group track for the kick, snare, and hat. Then the secondary chords, then the main sample that I used, and then some miscellaneous tracks for sound effects. So I figured the simplest way to go about this would be to just go through the track in chronological order. So this opening section of the track here was admittedly a little difficult. I actually have the track structure written down in my notebook here, and pretty much all I wrote was clipping sample and chords chop in. But I actually didn't know how I was going to realize the opening of the track until I'd finished pretty much everything else afterward. Completely forgetting, by the way, that I owned this Roland SP404 Mark II sampler, and when I put it into this breakbeat sample chopper, it just didn't sound right. The playback speed was way too fast, and no matter how slow I turned down my clock, it just wouldn't go any lower in pitch. But by playing around with the clock speed, I realized I could actually make some really cool, glitchy, stuttery effects. So instead of using that fancy sampler that my parents gracefully gifted me with their hard-earned money, I was just like, you know what, it's an interesting enough way to start the track, I'm just gonna record this and use it. which ended up sounding like this. You know, I feel like that is a really good example of this concept I learned from the lovely Sarah Bell Reed. The idea of sort of just accepting what's happening, regardless of how imperfect it is. And the more you practice accepting that process, the better you get at what it is you set out to do. And I mean, that idea really resonates with me because there have been a lot of moments in my own experience where, honestly, like, accepting laziness and misdirection has actually led to better results. I say laziness in the sense that, like, you know, I could have redid the whole thing at the beginning there with my sampler, but instead I chose to stick with what I had. A big part of what held me back from getting into the rhythm of actually making music for almost 2 years was my obsession with trying to make everything perfect and complicated and sophisticated, when what I really needed to do to succeed, and what I ended up doing, was stripping back the process a bit, making something simpler, and then working my way up to making better and more sophisticated music. I know I'm getting sidetracked at this point, but all I'm saying is making that section at the beginning of this track was a pretty good example of the mindset that helped me actually start making music and breaking out of that cycle of doubt. So anyway, after the sample intro thing, whatever you want to call it, like I wrote down in my notes, I wanted the chords to kind of chop in. So I took this recording here and sort of just, you know, like I said, chopped up the beginning of it so the chords sort of like stumble into the song. And so as the chords come in fully and become steadier, I figured maybe like a beat or something to sort of anchor this intro section would be a good idea. So I took this really basic 128 BPM 4 on the floor kick pattern. I used some sidechain compression on the samples so that when the chords play, the sample dips in volume. Because if I just let it, you know, continue at its normal volume, it probably would have gotten a little overwhelming. And pretty much what ended up happening, I didn't intend for this, but I think it turned out really well, was the kick ended up on the offbeats of the chords. So the way this section concludes, and it's something I do a couple times throughout this track, is over the course of this opening section, I slowly modulate the delay of the chords in volume, so that once the kick and the noise cut out, the delay on the chords will just ring out for a few seconds. So there's a brief period of silence here before the sample comes in. So I have the sample here transitioning abruptly into the bass with the kick. Initially this section kind of just opened with these steady kicks here over the bass, but a very important aspect of arranging music that I've been focusing on recently is transitions. And I noticed that when I had the kick and the bass coming in together, it just wasn't as satisfying. What I did here, it's a pretty simple fix. I pretty much just took one of these transients here, I split it off from the main audio track, so then there's just this one kick here that pretty much introduces the bass, couple bars of silence, then 2 kicks here, and then after another couple bars with just the bass, then the 4 on the floor kick comes in. I mean, it's simple things like that that make all the difference in a DAW arrangement, so just wanted to highlight that. So throughout this section, the drums are all gradually brought in along with the bass. I have these 2 compressors here which are sidechains to the primary and secondary chords, and so I make use of that in this next section here. And the individual tracks for the kick, snare, and hat all have a drum bus on them for some additional impact. I put some additional compression and EQ on the hat specifically because I was listening to the first rendition of the full mix in my car, and I realized that the hat was absolutely deafening. So pretty much all I did here was I reduced the dB and I cut out most of the highs. So to end this section, I did another ramp up in decay volume for the drum group track, so it would all just build up and have this section of release here. This is another quirky sort of transitional section here. Some of these are chops from the bass and the main sample that I used, but most of this stuff here is actually just like stock synth wave files from the Ableton audio library. Ableton has a surprisingly good selection of stock samples, so I figured I'd put them to use. And what's great is with some proper tinkering, you can make these sounds fit into pretty much any context. So to sort of jump back into all these primary sounds we're using, I included an early snare here. It comes in like a moment earlier than you'd expect, and that offset is usually a pretty fun technique. So for a good while, I had a bit of an issue with this next part, right? I had it written down in the track structure that the primary chords from the beginning were just going to come back into this next part. But I also wanted to do something with them so that they would sort of stand out in the mix, and initially it just wasn't happening. So I decided I'm just going to go full maximalist on this. I'm just going to use some heavy modulation to make it sound really industrial and blown out. So as you can see at the bottom here, there are about 50 different effects on this specific track. And so to accentuate this industrial craziness, I brought the main sample that I was using earlier back into the bottom of the mix. I didn't really plan any of this beforehand, but I ended up with this really chaotic, stressful middle section of the track. And this was the point where I just kind of accepted that this track was going to go in a much more chaotic direction than I initially envisioned. Something I like doing, by the way, to end off sections was I'll take chops of a particular track and then just mess around with the pitch of each individual chop. So you can see here that these 5 chops are ascending drastically in pitch. And just so these chords would cut all the way through the mix, I have some sidechain compression, specifically on the drum group track, that ducks all the drums whenever the chords increase in volume. Did you know that I like sidechain compression? So after this section here, where the chords and the sample fade out and it's just the bass and the drums again, so it kind of eases down a little bit, at least relatively. I decided, at least for now, I was kind of bored with my transition technique of delaying everything out. And so I wanted to make this big, sort of grandiose, ambient bridge section before the climax of the track. And I think this is another example of how I used, essentially, laziness to my advantage. Because I could have recorded a bunch of new ambient sounds, right? But instead, all I did was I took the primary and secondary chords, slowed them way down, and added these 2 additional tracks here, one of which is like a stock sort of television crowd effect that I deliberately placed very deep and low in the mix, so it would end up as this really quiet, almost dreamlike sound effect that you can barely even hear. I remember at one point I was listening back to this section and I actually spooked myself because it sounded like the television crowd track was coming from outside of my headphones. And then I took the 4 on the floor 128 BPM kick from the beginning of the track and just slowed it way down with some additional reverb and sidechain so it would pulse through the drone sounds really hard.
One eternity later.
Hello, I got a haircut and I'm moving like tomorrow and I have a lot of adrenaline in my system right now, so I'm just gonna speed through this last section as quickly as I can. This here is the climax of the track. So we transition out of the bridge section with the main sample here, which then goes into these 4 quick snare hits that sort of explode us into the final section of the track. The secondary chords are front and center. I added a couple brief sections where the drums cut out here. They're placed specifically when the noise fades back out of the secondary chords, so the track just has some breathing room. And to add some more nuance to this section, instead of just taking the drums away entirely, there's this one late snare here and a couple beats of the bass, just to create some unique offsets. Like I said, it's a seriously very versatile strategy, and I found myself like overusing it. This next section where the drums cut out, I have these very fast 4 on the floor kicks to add some additional tapping texture in the background of the mix, and then just a few stuttery sample chops of the main sample. So then that slams back into the drums again. There's one last break section here where the bass and the kick are gone, and you're just hearing the snare and the hat over the secondary chords. A few chops of the secondary chords to transition into the last section with the kick, the second to last of which is pitched up a bit to sort of catch your attention and properly transition you into the next section of the song. And then it's just the kick and the secondary chords until the kick eventually delays out. Initially, when the kick was at its normal pitch, there was this weird clicking transient at the end of each kick, and it just sounded kind of weird. So I pitched it down 11 semitones, and honestly, it works a lot better. Adds another little factor of nuance, and it just sounds better. This section also allows the secondary chords being sidechained to the kick to come out in full effect, so you can kind of just feel the punch of the rhythm at its core. So to end the track, after the kick delays out, the noise fades back out of the chords, and the sequence just loops until the sound eventually fades out. Whew. So yeah, that is my song. It's very strange and off-kilter and weird as shit, but I am very proud of it. Man, if only I had that much energy and confidence the rest of the video. So yeah, I'm not gonna lie, I definitely rushed this thing. I was not joking when I said I'm moving like tomorrow, but I think the mature thing to do as a person and as an artist is to admit to your shortcomings. This video, this whole project was just something I wanted to try out to sort of put myself out there and make at least somewhat of an attempt to advertise myself. Whether I'll even have time to make more of these leading up to the album remains to be seen, but I will definitely be releasing some of the singles from the album on the YouTube channel. Even as in-depth as I want, there were certain things in this video I wanted to cover but I kind of forgot to. So what I was thinking is, if I have time to do this in the next few months, I might release some tutorial videos for specific techniques that I've learned and want to share with people. Once again, no guarantees, but that is something I want to do, so if I'm able to do that. So if you made it to the end of this video, thank you kindly. I hope you enjoyed and were able to get at least something out of it. And even though it was very much a first attempt, I'm glad I was able to share my passion with whoever ends up watching this. If you did enjoy this video, I highly recommend checking out my music on Bandcamp, specifically the singles for this new album, as well as the album when it comes out. I'm not too experienced with this stuff, I'm still learning, but I have the drive to do what needs to be done to get my art out to people, so I hope I'm able to achieve that somehow. So thanks again for sticking around if you did. Peace out. See you next time.